The Shadow in the Attic. In 2013, a family in rural Pennsylvania moved into an old farmhouse. The property was a dream come true for them. Quiet, secluded, and full of character. The house had been vacant for several years, and while it was in decent condition, there were signs of neglect. Peeling paint, creaky floorboards, and an old attic that seemed perpetually cold. Within weeks of moving in, strange things began happening. At first they were small occurrences, misplaced items, odd drafts, and a persistent feeling of being watched, especially near the staircase leading to the attic. The family chalked it up to the quirks of an old house. One evening, while unpacking boxes in the living room, the mother, Jessica, heard soft footsteps above her. Thinking her husband or one of the kids was in the attic, she called out. When no one answered, she climbed the stairs to check. The attic door was shut, and when she opened it, the room was empty. Just as she was about to leave, she noticed something odd. A small, handprint-sized smudge on the dusty attic window, too high for any of her children to have made. Days turned into weeks, and the activity escalated. Doors would slam shut on their own, lights flickered, and at night, Jessica and her husband, Mark, would wake to faint whispering sounds. Their young daughter, Lily, began talking to an imaginary friend she called Mr. Thomas. When Jessica asked about him, Lily described him as a tall man with a funny hat who liked to hide in the shadows. One night, Mark decided to investigate the attic thoroughly. Armed with a flashlight, he climbed up and began searching through the piles of forgotten junk left by the previous owners. As he shifted an old trunk, he discovered something chilling: a diary. The entries, written in shaky handwriting, detailed the life of a man who had lived in the house during the early 1900s. The last few pages were unsettling, filled with paranoid ramblings about dark figures that watched him and whispered his name. The final entry read, "I can't take it anymore. The shadow is in me now." That same night, Jessica awoke to find Mark sitting bolt upright in bed, staring at the doorway. "Did you see him?" he whispered, his face pale. There was a man standing there. The family's dog, normally calm and friendly, began acting strangely, refusing to go upstairs and growling at the attic door. Things came to a head one stormy night. The power went out, plunging the house into darkness. As the family gathered in the living room, trying to stay calm, a loud, crashing sound came from above. Mark grabbed a baseball bat and went to investigate. Jessica begged him not to, but he insisted. When Mark reached the attic, he found it in complete disarray. Boxes were overturned, old furniture was scattered, and the attic window was wide open, rain pouring in. In the center of the room, etched into the floorboards, was a series of deep scratch marks forming a circle. As Mark stepped closer, the attic door slammed shut behind him, trapping him in pitch darkness. Jessica and the kids heard him scream. When she finally managed to pry the door open, she found Mark lying unconscious on the floor, his face pale and his shirt torn. He mumbled incoherently about the shadow and refused to sleep in the house again. The family moved out the following week, abandoning most of their belongings. Years later, Jessica learned through a neighbor that the house had a grim history. A man in the 1920s had reportedly gone insane and hung himself in the attic. Before his death, he had complained to friends about a shadowy figure that haunted him, whispering to him in the night. The farmhouse still stands, but no one has lived there since. Local residents say they sometimes see flickering lights in the attic and hear faint whispers when they walk by. Some even claim that if you stand near the house on a quiet night, you can see a tall, shadowy figure watching you from the window, waiting for its next visitor. The Forgotten Asylum. In a remote corner of rural Maine, hidden behind a dense forest of skeletal trees, stood Blackwood Asylum. Built in the early 1900s, it had been a facility for the mentally ill, many of whom were abandoned by society and forgotten by their families. Decades of abuse, experimental treatments, and overcrowding led to its closure in 1974. But rumors of strange occurrences lingered long after its doors were shut. Locals claimed to hear screams coming from the empty building, even on nights when the wind was still. Despite the warnings, in October 2022, a group of 5 college friends decided to explore the abandoned asylum. It was Halloween, and they wanted a thrill. Armed with flashlights, a camera, and a cheap Ouija board they had picked up at a novelty store, they made their way to the crumbling structure. The building loomed over them, its windows shattered like jagged teeth, its brick walls streaked with moss and decay. The air grew colder as they stepped inside. The smell of mildew and rot filled their nostrils, and the faint creak of the floorboards echoed through the empty halls. The group split up to explore, their laughter masking their nervousness. Maria, the self-proclaimed skeptic, led the way with her boyfriend Jake, while the others, Sam, Emily, and Derek, stayed close behind. They wandered through the asylum's eerie corridors, stumbling upon rusted gurneys, broken restraints, and graffiti-covered walls. In one room, they found a stack of old patient files, their yellowed pages brittle to the touch. One file caught Emily's eye. It belonged to a patient named Eliza Crane, admitted in 1969. The notes described her as violent and delusional, claiming she saw shadow people who whispered her name and commanded her to harm others. Her file ended abruptly, with a single word scrawled in red ink: escaped. The group laughed nervously, brushing off the discovery as just another spooky detail of the asylum's dark history. But as they ventured deeper, the atmosphere grew oppressive. The air felt heavier, and the faint sound of footsteps seemed to follow them, though no one was there. Finally, they reached the asylum's basement, where the most dangerous patients had been confined. The walls were lined with rusted cages, and the faint smell of burnt wood lingered. Derek suggested they use the Ouija board, and despite Maria's protests, they all sat in a circle on the damp, cold floor. "Is anyone here with us?" Sam asked as he placed his fingers on the planchette. At first, nothing happened, but then, the planchette began to move, spelling out a single word: run. They froze, staring at each other, unsure if someone was playing a prank. But before they could speak, the temperature plummeted, and a loud, inhuman scream echoed through the basement. Their flashlights flickered, and shadows began to move along the walls. Shadows that didn't belong to them. Panicking, they grabbed their things and bolted for the exit. As they ran through the labyrinth of hallways, the shadows followed, growing darker and more distinct. Maria tripped and screamed as she felt icy fingers grip her ankle, but Jake pulled her to her feet, and they kept running. When they finally burst through the front doors, the cold night air hit them like a slap. They didn't stop until they reached their car, peeling away from the asylum as fast as they could. The group didn't speak of what happened for weeks, trying to convince themselves it had all been in their heads. But the nightmares began soon after. Emily woke up one night to find her closet door ajar, despite having closed it before bed. In the darkness, she swore she saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her. Sam started hearing whispers, his name repeated over and over, no matter where he went. Derek's dog refused to enter his room, barking and growling at the empty doorway. The worst was Maria. One night she called Jake, sobbing. She said she had seen a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed. "It's her," Maria whispered. "Eliza. She's real." The line went dead. When Jake arrived at Maria's apartment, he found the door wide open. Inside, her room was in disarray, with claw-like scratches covering the walls. Maria was gone. The only trace of her was the Ouija board, Tsikizi, sitting on the bed with the planchette resting on the word goodbye. To this day, no one knows what happened to Maria, or what followed them out of Blackwood Asylum. Locals say the building was demolished last year, But those who venture near the site still claim to hear faint screams and see shadows moving in the woods, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to return. The aftermath. Months passed since Maria's disappearance, but the group of friends never truly moved on. The police had investigated but found no leads, dismissing her case as a runaway or abduction. Jake, however, couldn't shake the feeling that Maria's disappearance was something far worse. He replayed that last phone call in his mind, haunted by her voice whispering Eliza's name. Jake became obsessed with uncovering the truth. He began digging deeper into the history of Blackwood Asylum, poring over old newspaper archives and forgotten records. What he found was chilling. Eliza Crane hadn't escaped. She had died in the asylum. The report said she was locked in the basement after attacking a nurse, but during a fire that broke out in 1971, her body was never recovered. Witnesses claimed the fire had been unnatural, spreading too fast, with an eerie, blue-tinged flame. Survivors spoke of hearing laughter echoing through the smoke, though no one could explain its source. As Jake delved further, strange things started happening. His computer would freeze, the screen glitching with images of shadowy figures. At night, his phone would light up with calls from unknown numbers, and when he answered, he'd hear static, and faintly, Maria's voice calling his name. Sam, Emily, and Derek begged Jake to let it go. They had all been plagued by their own terrors. Sam had quit his job after hearing whispers in the office at night. Emily had moved in with her sister after waking up to find deep scratches on her arms. Derek stopped sleeping entirely, claiming that every time he closed his eyes, he felt something breathing on his neck. But Jake couldn't stop. He was convinced Maria was still alive, or that whatever had taken her could be stopped. He tracked down the last surviving staff member of Blackwood Asylum, a retired janitor named Arthur Graves. Arthur lived in a rundown trailer on the edge of town, a paranoid recluse who only agreed to talk after Jake brought a bottle of whiskey. As the night wore on, Arthur revealed the truth about Eliza. She wasn't just some crazy girl, Arthur muttered, his voice trembling. She knew things. The doctors thought she was schizophrenic, hearing voices and all. But those weren't just voices. She was talking to something evil. Arthur explained that Eliza had claimed the shadows were alive, feeding off pain and fear. She had warned that they were growing stronger, and when she died in the fire, they didn't leave. They had become the asylum. "She's still there," Arthur said, his eyes darting to the darkened corners of the trailer. "And now you've woken her up." Jake left Arthur's trailer shaken but determined. He convinced Sam, Emily, and Derek to go back to Blackwood Asylum one last time. They needed to confront whatever was haunting them and hopefully save Maria. The return. The asylum's ruins were even more foreboding in the moonlight. Most of the structure had collapsed, but the basement remained, a gaping wound in the earth. Armed with flashlights, salt, and a makeshift plan to destroy the Ouija board that had started it all, they descended into the darkness. The air grew colder with each step, and the shadows seemed to pulse and writhe like living things. They reached the room where they had last used the Ouija board, and there it was, untouched, sitting in the middle of the floor. Jake placed the board in the center of a salt circle and doused it with gasoline. As he lit the match, the room exploded with noise, a cacophony of screams, laughter, and whispers. The shadows surged toward them, their shapes morphing into elongated arms and jagged teeth. "Burn it! Burn it now!" Sam shouted, swinging his flashlight wildly at the encroaching darkness. Jake dropped the match, and the board went up in flames. For a moment, the shadows recoiled, shrieking as if in pain. But then, a figure emerged from the blackness, tall, skeletal, and unmistakably human. It was Eliza. Her eyes glowed white-hot, and her mouth twisted into a smile that was all wrong. "You think you can stop me?" she hissed, her voice echoing with 100 others. "You brought me back. You belong to me now." Emily screamed as the shadows lunged at them. Jake grabbed her hand, dragging her toward the exit. Derek and Sam followed, but the darkness moved faster. Derek was the first to fall, a shadowy arm piercing his chest and dragging him into the void. Jake and the others barely made it out. As they stumbled into the night, the asylum shuddered, its ruins collapsing inward as if being consumed by the earth itself. The final curse. Weeks later, Jake sat alone in his apartment, staring at a photograph of the group from before the asylum. They looked so carefree, so alive. Now it was just him and Emily. Sam had taken his own life days after their return, leaving behind a note that simply read, "She's here." Emily refused to speak about what had happened. She moved to another state, changed her number, and disappeared from Jake's life. But Jake knew it wasn't over. Every night, the shadows in his apartment grew darker, longer, and closer, and every night he heard her voice, whispering from the darkness, "You can't run forever."